Imagine a war is completely, unconditionally lost. Your supreme leader is dead. Your capital city is nothing but a smoking graveyard of shattered brick and twisted steel. Your armies have surrendered, and foreign troops patrol every single inch of your country. The nightmare is officially over. Now, imagine waking up the very next morning, putting on a perfectly pressed military uniform, pinning a row of gleaming medals to your chest, walking into an office, and pretending that you still rule an empire. It sounds completely absurd. It sounds like the plot of a dark, psychological movie. But in the middle of May 1945, more than 2 weeks after Nazi Germany had unconditionally surrendered to the Allied forces, this exact, bizarre scenario was playing out in real life. In a quiet, untouched coastal town near the Danish border, the surviving high command of the Third Reich had established a phantom government. They held daily cabinet meetings. They issued official government decrees to an army that no longer existed. They saluted each other in the hallways. They drank fine wine and sincerely believed that the United States and Great Britain would recognize them as the legitimate, ruling government of a new Germany. They were living in a staggering, breathtaking bubble of pure narcissistic delusion. But on the morning of May 23, 1945, the Allied High Command decided that this pathetic, theatrical circus had gone on long enough. General Dwight D. Eisenhower dispatched a heavily armed task force, led by American Major General Lowell Rooks, to deliver a brutal dose of reality. The Americans did not come to negotiate. They did not come to recognize a new government. They came to kick the doors in, rip off the medals, and permanently erase the last remaining delusion of the master race. To understand how this phantom government even existed, and why the Americans delivered such a humiliating psychological knockout blow, we have to look at the chaotic power vacuum left behind by the death of Adolf Hitler. To truly grasp the absolute absurdity of the situation the American soldiers found themselves in, we must rewind to the final days of April 1945. As the Soviet Red Army closed in on his underground bunker in Berlin, Adolf Hitler realized the end had arrived. Before taking his own life, he dictated his final political testament. In a move that shocked many of his top generals, he did not name Heinrich Himmler or Hermann Göring as his successor. Instead, he named Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, the commander of the German Navy and the mastermind behind the deadly U-boat campaigns, as the new president of the Reich. Donitz was located far to the north, away from the burning capital. When he received the news of his promotion, he immediately moved his headquarters to Flensburg, a small, picturesque port city near the border of Denmark. The city had largely escaped the devastating Allied bombing raids, making it a perfectly quiet, surreal setting for the final act of the regime. Donitz quickly assembled a cabinet of surviving high-ranking officials. He brought in Generaloberst Alfred Jodl, the chief of the operations staff. He brought in Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel. For the first week of May, this Flensburg government actually served a practical military purpose. Donitz used his authority to order the remaining German forces to surrender to the advancing British and American armies, desperately trying to save millions of German soldiers from falling into the vengeful hands of the Soviets in the East. On May 7th and May 8th, representatives of the Flensburg government officially signed the documents of unconditional surrender. The Second World War in Europe was completely over. The guns fell silent. By every logical, international, and legal standard, the German government ceased to exist the moment that ink dried. But Karl Dönitz and his cabinet simply refused to accept reality. Instead of stepping down, packing their bags, and awaiting trial, they went right back to work. Inside the beautiful red brick Marine Schule, the German Naval Academy in Flensburg, They continued to operate as if they were a sovereign, independent government. They held highly formal morning briefings. They drafted memos regarding post-war agriculture and economic policies. They strictly enforced military discipline among the hundreds of German guards still stationed in the town. They walked the manicured lawns wearing pristine uniforms, their boots polished, their chests heavily decorated. They were surrounded by the ashes of Europe, but inside their quiet naval academy, they were still the masters of the universe. Why would highly intelligent military commanders engage in such a pathetic game of make-believe? Why didn't they just run and hide? The answer lies in the profound, deeply ingrained arrogance of the German elite and their massive misunderstanding of American and British politics. Grand Admiral Donitz and General Jodl were playing a high-stakes, desperate gamble. They knew that the alliance between the Western powers, the United States and Great Britain, and the Soviet Union was incredibly fragile. The Germans firmly believed that it was only a matter of time before the capitalist West and the communist East went to war with each other. The Flensburg government genuinely believed that the Americans and the British would realize they needed a strong, organized, and experienced German leadership to help them fight the Russians. They assumed that men like Winston Churchill and General Eisenhower would look past the concentration camps, look past the atrocities, and pragmatically recognize their newly formed government. They expected to be treated as respected diplomatic partners. They expected to keep their ranks, their privileges, and their comfortable lives. They believed their own propaganda. They thought they were simply too brilliant and too valuable to be treated like common criminals. Let me pause right here and ask you a quick question. Knowing the massive threat the Soviet Union posed after the war, do you think the Americans should have actually used these experienced German generals to fight the communists? Or was arresting them the only moral choice? Drop your opinion in the comments below, because the Allied leaders had to make that exact decision. For 2 long weeks, the Allies actually allowed this bizarre situation to continue. The British forces controlling the Flensburg area simply ignored the German cabinet, treating them as a temporary administrative convenience to help process the millions of surrendered German troops. But this temporary patience gave the arrogant Nazi leaders the false hope they craved. Every day they were not arrested, their delusion grew stronger. They began demanding diplomatic immunity. They began complaining to British officers about the quality of their food. They mistook Allied patience for Allied weakness. The news of this phantom government operating freely in northern Germany quickly reached the desk of the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. And Eisenhower was absolutely furious. Eisenhower had recently toured the liberated concentration camps of Ohrdruf and Buchenwald. He had stared directly into the mass graves. He had smelled the stench of the execution sheds. His patience for the German High Command had been permanently and violently erased. To Eisenhower, the men sitting in the Flensburg Naval Academy, holding polite cabinet meetings, were not legitimate politicians. They were not honorable military strategists. They were the architects of a genocidal, criminal enterprise. Furthermore, the Soviet Union was growing incredibly suspicious. The Russians were furious that the Americans and the British were seemingly allowing a new Nazi government to operate on their watch. Stalin accused the West of secretly plotting to keep the German command structure intact. Eisenhower knew that the Flensburg circus had to be shut down immediately. There would be no negotiations. There would be no diplomatic recognition. There would only be absolute, uncompromising justice. He selected American Major General Lowell W. Rooks, a tough, no-nonsense veteran commander, to execute the mission. He was ordered to go into Flensburg, accompanied by heavily armed British and American troops, and permanently dissolve the fake government. Eisenhower's orders were crystal clear. They were to be arrested not as a recognized government, but as prisoners of war and suspected war criminals. The era of gentlemen's agreements was over. It was time to pull the plug. On the morning of May 23, 1945, the sky over Flensburg was bright and clear. Inside the Naval Academy, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz and his top officials were going about their daily routine. They were dressed in their finest uniforms. They had just finished a morning meeting discussing administrative policies for a nation they did not control. Suddenly, the heavy, unmistakable rumble of armored vehicles echoed through the quiet coastal town. A massive task force of heavily armed British tanks, armored cars, and American infantry completely surrounded the Naval Academy. The Allied troops did not politely knock on the gates. They established heavy machine gun positions aimed directly at the windows. British soldiers with fixed bayonets stormed the courtyards, immediately disarming the stunned German guards who had been standing at attention just moments before. Inside the building, the illusion of the Flensburg government shattered in an instant. American Major General Lowell Rooks, accompanied by British and Soviet officers, marched directly into the headquarters. He did not salute. He did not offer friendly military greetings. He sent a blunt message to Grand Admiral Donitz, General Jodl, and General Admiral von Friedeberg. He ordered them to pack their bags and report immediately to his temporary office on the passenger ship Patria, which was docked in the harbor. The German commanders, sensing that their elaborate game of make-believe was finally crashing down, desperately tried to maintain their dignity. They put on their long leather coats. They adjusted their service caps. They grabbed their polished ceremonial batons. They were driven under heavy armed guard to the ship. When they walked into the room to face Major General Rooks, they still expected a degree of professional respect. They expected a formal, polite dialogue between commanding officers. General Rooks sat behind a simple table. He looked at the three most powerful men remaining in the Third Reich with absolute, emotionless efficiency. He did not ask them to sit down. He looked at a piece of paper, and then he looked directly at Donitz. "I am in receipt of instructions from General Eisenhower," Rooks stated, his voice completely devoid of any diplomatic warmth. "He has directed me to inform you that he has decided to terminate the acting German government. You and all members of your cabinet are to be placed under arrest as prisoners of war." Donitz stood frozen. The words hung in the air like a physical weight. The grand aristocratic dream of being recognized as the leader of a new Germany evaporated in a single sentence. "Any word from me would be superfluous," Donitz replied quietly, his massive ego completely deflated. But General Rooks was not finished. The Americans knew exactly who they were dealing with, and they knew the extreme, cowardly lengths these men would go to in order to avoid facing true justice. Just a few hours prior to this meeting, the Allies had captured Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS. Himmler had managed to bite down on a hidden cyanide capsule while being examined by a British doctor, choosing a coward's suicide over facing a war crimes tribunal. The Americans were absolutely determined not to let the top leadership of the Flensburg government pull the same cowardly trick. They needed them alive. They needed them to stand trial before the entire world. When Donitz, Jodl, and the rest of the cabinet were taken back to the Naval Academy to gather their belongings, the Americans initiated a psychological breakdown that was completely unprecedented for men of their rank. The American and British troops did not just casually search their luggage. They executed a highly invasive, deeply humiliating security protocol. The aristocratic, highly decorated generals and admirals, men who had commanded millions of troops and lived like royalty for 12 years, were ordered to step into the center of the room. Heavily armed American GIs surrounded them. "Take off your clothes," the American guards ordered. The German high command gasped in absolute shock. Stripping a high-ranking officer naked is considered the ultimate violation of military dignity. They protested. They argued that it was completely unnecessary. They demanded to be treated with the respect due to their prestigious ranks. The American soldiers completely ignored their protests. They raised their rifles and repeated the command. Slowly, humiliated beyond comprehension, the leaders of the master race unbuttoned their tailored tunics. They took off their silver medals. They removed their polished boots and their trousers. They stood completely naked, shivering in the cold rooms of the academy, while ordinary 19-year-old American and British privates systematically searched every single inch of their clothing, their mouths, and their hair for hidden poison capsules. Think about this moment for a second. Do you think stripping these high-ranking generals naked was a step too far by the American troops? Or was it the absolute perfect way to strip them of their arrogant pride and ensure they faced justice? Tell us in the comments right now. The psychological impact of this moment was catastrophic for the German leaders. A uniform provides a man with an identity. It provides him with a shield of authority. When you take the uniform away from an arrogant narcissist, you take away his entire world. Standing naked under the harsh glare of the American soldiers, Donitz, Jodl, and the rest of the cabinet suddenly realized how incredibly pathetic and powerless they truly were. They were no longer the fearsome leaders of an unstoppable empire. They were just ordinary, aging, defeated old men. The illusion of their superiority was scrubbed away in an instant. During the search, the Americans found what they were looking for. Several of the officers had hidden vials of cyanide taped inside their clothing or concealed in their luggage. The Americans confiscated all of it. They were not going to be allowed to escape. However, one man, General Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeburg, managed to ask for a moment of privacy to use the restroom before the search was completed. He had a capsule of cyanide hidden in his clothing. Unable to face the overwhelming humiliation and the reality of his defeat, he bit down on the glass. He collapsed on the floor and died within minutes. The rest of the Flensburg government was not so lucky. After being thoroughly searched and dressed in plain, unadorned clothing, the entire cabinet was marched out into the courtyard of the Naval Academy. Hundreds of Allied soldiers, journalists, and photographers were waiting for them. The cameras flashed endlessly. The world was given a front-row seat to the final, pathetic downfall of the Nazi regime. They were loaded onto the back of open military trucks, sitting shoulder to shoulder like common street criminals. There were no luxury cars. There were no salutes. There was only the harsh, unforgiving road leading to the prison camps, and ultimately to the courtroom at Nuremberg. Operation Blackout, the arrest of the Flensburg government, is one of the most deeply satisfying moments of the immediate post-war period. It perfectly highlights the massive difference between how the Axis powers viewed themselves and how the Allied forces viewed them. The men who ran the Third Reich lived in a state of perpetual, narcissistic delusion. They believed that their crimes could be erased simply by pinning on a clean uniform and offering a polite handshake to the conquering army. They genuinely thought they could talk their way out of accountability by pretending to be civilized, indispensable gentlemen. But men like General Dwight D. Eisenhower and Major General Lowell Rooks refused to play along with their theatrical delusions. The United States military understood that you cannot negotiate with a phantom. You cannot offer respect to men who have entirely abandoned their humanity. The only way to deal with an arrogant tyrant who refuses to accept reality is to kick the door down, strip him of his illusions, and force him to look at the cold, hard truth. By arresting the Flensburg government, denying them diplomatic immunity, and subjecting them to the humiliating, necessary procedures of common prisoners, the Allies delivered the final, undeniable knockout blow to the Nazi ego. They proved that no matter how many medals you wear, and no matter how grand your titles are, an empire built on cruelty and lies will always end exactly the same way: handcuffed, humiliated, and exposed to the light of justice. What do you think of Eisenhower's swift and brutal shutdown of the Flensburg government? Was stripping the German generals of their uniforms the ultimate, perfect reality check? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. If you appreciate the raw, authentic, and untold history of World War II, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story of true historical justice. Thank you for watching. Respect the fallen, honor the veterans, and never forget history. We will see you in the next video.